Hey guys, I wanted to follow up on my blog about how being a good student doesn't mean being a good learner. In fact, perhaps quite the opposite. In the blog, I talked about the role of learning differences impacting kind of how a student sees himself or herself in the class, and then therefore impacting kind of like whether that student's a good student or not, and then kind of making judgments about learning from that. I want to kind of go deeper about something I think is even more important. Good students, right? Students who get good grades, they're very accustomed to kind of a prefabricated pathway to learning, right? Like teachers say, this is what's on the test. They're like, okay, that's what's on the test. And then they knock that out, regurgitate it. These students often have major problems, showing their potential on tests like the SAT and ACT, and these tests quickly get kind of a bad name, or students get the name of being a bad test taker, one way or the other. But the reality is that students with really good grades often are the least receptive to learning for the following reasons. So, one, a lot of times with school, it's kind of a race to the bottom, right? You're like trying to get the best grade possible with the least amount of effort, pretty much, which is good, except that as long as like you're learning in between. But that's not necessarily the case. It's kind of, in school we know that like students will kind of learn something for a test, forget it, and move on to the next thing. That's problematic in and of itself. So that translates in tutoring to kind of also the manifestation of that reality, which is that students start getting more concerned with like just kind of that pat on the head, like you did a good job, than actually like recognizing whether they actually learned something, right? Because I think in school you kind of get used to not deeply learning things, but just kind of like figuring out what a teacher wants and giving that teacher what he or she wants. That's problematic for the test because students in tutoring for the SAT, they'll consistently just like wait for you to say that's a good job and think that's enough. Whereas they're not really concerned about like, am I independently able to do this on my own? It's like a thought that hardly crosses students' mind during tutoring, which is crazy because these same students are really concerned with improving their tests to get, their score on their tests to get into a really great school. So I think that's the primary concern when you're thinking about like why good students are bad learners, is that school kind of rewards not being a good learner, right? Like, and the last piece of it is the way school kind of encourages kids to hide things, right? It's like, if a teacher doesn't know I don't know this, then a teacher can't penalize me with a bad grade. Meanwhile, when tutoring and when you're working to like do well on a test, all I talk about is that like it's essential to like for me to know what students don't know. So like making mistakes is the kind of the bread and butter of making improvements. So like imagine a kid just like basically impeding me from doing my job constantly because they think success is the opposite, because it is in school, right? Like hiding stuff doesn't help learning. It helps you become a good student.